Hello and welcome to our international news presentation, where we'll be talking about global sports events.
Our aim is to answer this question primarily. What are the challenges that journalists face when reporting on global sports events? We'll also be covering the different people, organisations or forces that influence news coverage of global sports events and using case studies and research to illustrate our points. Politics comes into all of our challenges, so we will be referring to that throughout.
Yeah, so first up is gender, which can be an enormous barrier to reporting global sports events and generally in the industry as a whole, even with all the progress that has been made in this century. Now, we're going to show you this video, which was taken about 2 weeks ago during the FIFA Club World Cup. Now, as you saw in the video, the male referees were allowed to shake hands with the Qatari prince, whereas the female officials were ordered to walk straight past. This might be on the pitch, but also refers to those off the pitch or in the press box. What's happened there is a very important thing and can give us an insight into the future. Qatar will host the 2022 Football World Cup. However, the country is very strict on women's rights. While Qatar is going to be a challenge for female journalists, this issue is something that they have to deal with on an everyday basis. Scholars such as Manuel Zenkis and Muneina Moniki argue that gender is one of the most important factors that affect how a person is perceived by society. Now, in a journal titled The Intersection of Race, Gender and Nationality in Sport, both academics stated that while the intersection of gender and race is understudied, there is clear evidence that women, and especially women of color, still find themselves at the very bottom of nearly every social indicator. They use the term defeminizing when it comes to females in the sports industry, and that refers to both journalists and athletes. A prime example of that would be Serena Williams. She is an athlete and a pundit and had to deal with questions regarding her body attire that included people saying that she looks like a man. It's a regular occurrence for female journalists. They are targeted on social media with comments such as, you know nothing about sport, or you're doing the best football podcast ever. Now, we'll get into more detail about gender in a little bit, but now we'll hear some more about theories from Sam.
Thank you. David Rowe is a well-known sports journalism scholar, and he's published many pieces about the industry's development. His research has revealed a heavily gendered sports world, with the women the focus of only 14% of sport coverage and constituting only 5% of sports journalists with bylines. They also seem more easy to criticize by audiences. You might remember this picture. This is from the Olympics. Helen Skelton, BBC presenter, she was crucified by audiences and some other media outlets too for wearing what's perceived to be a very short dress. And men rarely have to deal with any appearance issues. The next challenge is safety for journalists.
Now, as you can see on the slide that's coming up, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 2% of all journalists killed since 1992 worked on the sports beat. Now, Kristen Sparr, in her journal titled The Dangers of Sports Journalism, states that the sport market grows faster than GDP in nearly every country. Academics such as Boyle claim that the economic developments within the sport industry have profound political, economical, and social implications. Sports journalism used to live in its own sections in newspapers and broadcasting programs, but today, sport as a subject has found itself spreading beyond the territory of sports journalists themselves. Sports journalism is everywhere nowadays, from print to social media, and it deals with more than just covering sporting events. For instance, freelance journalists have been instrumental in exposing two of the most recent scandals in the sports world, namely the widespread corruption within the International Football Federation FIFA and the systematic doping of athletes in Russia. In the case of FIFA, investigative journalists such as Jens Weinrich and Andrew Jennings have tirelessly documented mismanagement, within FIFA for many years, to an extent that finally caught the eye of the American FBI. Now, Christian Sparr further argues that this rapid growth means that sports journalists are becoming increasingly targeted and abused. For instance, the BH Journalists Association in Bosnia and Herzegovina reported an attack on a TV crew after a football match in 2015, stating that attacks on journalists and media crews are frequent, especially in games involving a higher risk. In the UK, a Channel 4 news report in 2012 about the Rangers Football Club in Glasgow included an interview with a representative for the National Union of Journalists who had been contacted by more than 30 journalists in Scotland with concerns for their safety after working on the story about the Rangers' economic collapse. Now, these are only a few examples that are part of Christian Sparr's research that found more than 78 articles relating to sports journalism abuse. It happened in 35 different countries on 6 different continents, and the search was only done in English, which suggests that there are many more reports like that. Another example of that would be in Greece, where an editor of a Greek newspaper was stabbed in 2004 after working on different football scandals. Now, he later linked the attacks to the coverage.
Next, we're just going to be talking about access for journalists, starting with broadcasting rights. So yes, these can sometimes be a problem for journalists. All the rights to a sporting code or sporting event can be held by a single organisation. So that means it might be difficult for those from lower organisations and ones without like massive readerships to break in and get the coverage that they want. And yeah, sports personalities, athletes themselves might also simply avoid journalists from some publications because they don't think the coverage they're going to get is significant, and that's going to be a problem, especially for up and coming journalists.
Now, gender also affects access. A very interesting study carried out by Lucy Scotch in her research article titled "Feminine Writing: The Effect of Gender on the Work of Women Sports Journalists" has claimed that today sports journalism still has the fewest women when compared to other sections of the dailies. Of the 61 sports journalists, only 13% are women, and half of the sports newsrooms are exclusively run by men, and that was in Switzerland. Like in the British or US press, where women constitute respectively about 9% and 13% of the sports journalists. Now, sports journalism remains a traditionally male journalistic arena in Switzerland, despite the increasing participation of women in sports. Scott further argued that editors-in-chief seem to think that women are predisposed to treat news differently from men, and they assume that women have a different outlook on sport, which leads them to write sports journalism that is focused on the emotional and human aspects, and which can bring in a new readership that is less familiar with sport. She then concluded by saying that it's not only the case in Switzerland, but also in the USA and the UK. Now we'll be talking about accuracy with regards to reporting on global sports events.
Pressures from higher authorities can make a difference in how these events are reported, particularly from the host country's perspective. I read a study and some research about the 2005 World Athletics Championships in Helsinki and how the Finnish media reported it compared to the foreign media. 91% of Finns were following the event through the media, so the reputation portrayed was always going to be very, very important. However, in this discourse, sports were mostly seen as a tool for achieving visibility and economic profits. So a scholar argued, Falk Hema, makes the point about places trying to attract investments, tourists, taxpayers, needing good publicity strategies, marketing, branding, and good coverage from the media for the event. The general tone of the news items leading up to the event were very friendly, and the closer the championships came, the more favourable the news became. The press announced the World Championships as a feast for the whole nation, and that shows how the event is kind of a way of marketing cities. From this, governments promoting positive media coverage, that's going to have an impact on how accurately sporting events might be reported, since they need and want that good coverage from the media. And since the audience of the media is so big as well, sports events here are essentially being used as a marketing tool, and they relate to what columnist Hannu Ratilia says as the commercialization of sports which we've seen in this century. I'll just mention some more research I did on England's bid for the FIFA World Cup in 2018, which was another enormous international sport event. The BBC were planning to release a panorama on FIFA during the bidding campaign, and that attracted criticism from the Prime Minister David Cameron at the time, and other British media organisations too. And yeah, I mean, all in all, it seems to be increasingly difficult to hold the powers to account with accurate reporting. In this case, the BBC. The economic impacts of England winning a bid to the FIFA World Cup were enormous, so that seemed to take priority.
Yeah, now another case study that we looked at was the Russian Sochi 2014 Winter Olympics. Kristen Sparr has stated that very few journalists specialize in covering sports mega events such as Olympic Games, Commonwealth Games, and World Championships. Now, the importance of mega events in this context lies in the fact that coverage of global sporting events involves a very large number of journalists, even those from outside the sports beats. Moreover, journalists are often interested in covering issues that go beyond the sporting activities themselves and include social, political, and environmental matters related to the event. Now, research from the Danish Institute for Sports Studies shows that since 2010, the biggest sports mega events, such as the Olympic Games, World Cups in football, Formula One, and international tennis tournaments, have increasingly moved away from democratic countries in Europe, the US, and Japan to other countries in Asia, the Middle East, South America, and Russia. Now, Griggs and Lee argued that hosting mega events is an exercise in public diplomacy, where emerging states such as China and Brazil seek to project and boost their soft power in the international system. That argument applies to authoritarian states such as Qatar and Russia, as well as Brazil. And therefore, journalists covering sports mega events in the future are increasingly likely to come up against stakeholders and political regimes that rank very low when it comes to protecting human rights or media freedom. Now, according to Russian scholar Anna Akisieva, when Russia won the right to host the 2014 Winter Olympics in 2007, President Vladimir Putin commented that Russia's winning bid was without a doubt an assessment of the country. Against the backdrop legacy of disappointment from the 1980 Moscow Olympics, which were boycotted by 61 nations, Russia has poured unprecedented financial and political capital into the Olympic project. Now, before Russia won the Olympic bid, infrastructure in the area was poor and large sports facilities were non-existent. And never before has the Olympic site required so much development. And the Russian government's financial pledge to the Olympic project, which has ranged anywhere from $8 billion to around $50 billion, has made Sochi 2014 the most expensive Winter Games in the history of the Olympics. Now, the motivation behind the projects extends beyond economics. As an archetype of Russia's development strategy under the Putin government, Sochi 2014 illustrates how high-profile mega projects pursued by the Russian government are largely aimed at image building. The next challenge we'll be briefly talking about is attachment, and we'll talk about our own experiences as well as research and case studies.
Just going to touch on this one. We're happy to answer a few questions afterwards. Reading Martin Bell's work made this quite an interesting one. I support various sports teams, as does Chris. And is it likely to make me biased if I then report on them? Probably, because in sport you really sort of have a connection with your team, and it can be different to really remain professional in the moments. And sort of I wouldn't sort of compare sport to any other area of journalism, to be honest. And it's an area where attachment's inevitable, but it's not sort of really what you should be when you're reporting.
Yeah, so now we've gone through reporting on global sports events.
Just to end, one event I'd love to cover if I was to cover a global sport event would be the Cricket World Cup. Cricket's my favourite sport. I've always dreamed about playing abroad, going abroad to watch it. So that would fit the criteria. But just don't put me on an England game.
See, I'd love to cover a football World Cup one day, but it will hopefully be in a country where human rights are being upheld and women are allowed to drive.
Thank you for watching our presentation. We're more than happy to answer any questions you might have now.